Hello? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Perfect. Thank you. Well, hello. Welcome to the 2025 Jean and Bill Boziotis Lecture in Architecture. This lecture was made possible by a generous endowment created in 2014 by Bill Boziotis, FAIA of Dallas. Bill died in 2016, and while I never had the opportunity to meet him, he leaves an enduring legacy that continues to shape the school today. Bill was a celebrated architect and a 1957 graduate of the School of Architecture. He was a student of the Texas Rangers and remained an active member of the school's community for the rest of his life. He chaired the school's advisory council in the 1970s and again from 2012 to 2014. I understand that Bill was instrumental in hiring Hal Box as dean, a significant event in the school's history. In the 1980s, Bill designed an expansion of Sutton Hall to make a suitable environment for teaching architecture, and later an addition to Goldsmith Hall. This project includes spaces such as our lecture hall, conference room, the main jury room, and the lovely office that I have where I spend too many hours. In making the gift to create this lecture endowment, Bill was inspired by his own experiences of hearing Frank Lloyd Wright and Marcel Breuer as a student. I would also like to recognize and thank Mary McDermott Cook and the Eugene McDermott Foundation for their generous support of the Boziotis Lecture. The McDermotts were close friends of Jean and Bill Boziotis and are great patrons of important architecture in Dallas, as well as on the MIT campus. We are grateful for the Boziotis and McDermotts for their generosity and vision in creating this lecture and allowing the UT School of Architecture to bring some of the most talented architects to our students, faculty, alumni, and friend. So thank you for joining us for the third event of the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture Fall 2025 lecture series called Planetary Imaginaries. It's a place in which we aim to situate design within the broader systems that sustain planetary life. Today, we welcome Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi, co-founders of the celebrated New York City-based studio Weiss Manfredi, a practice that explicitly places environmental stewardship and sustainability at the core of their work. This evening, they will present their talk, Drifting Symmetries, Projects and Provocations, in which they will share work and research that transcends the boundaries between landscape, infrastructure, and architecture by reinventing sites in response to environmental and societal challenges. They will also delve into their newest monogram, Drifting Symmetries, Projects, Provocations, and Other Enduring Models, which was published by Park Books this year. This publication serves as a manual for expanding the terrain of contemporary architecture to construct more resilient settings for contemporary life. Weiss Manfredi received the 2024 Louis Kahn Award, the 2020 Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medal in Architecture, and the 2018 Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Institution's National Design Award, as well as the New York AIA Gold Medal and the Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Whew, they're busy. Their multidisciplinary portfolio is nothing short of prolific, with celebrated work for the Seattle Art Museum's beautiful Olympic Sculpture Park, the Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center and Overlook, and Hunters Point South Waterfront Park. Their ongoing projects include an international competition to re-envision the world-renowned La Brea Tar Pits and Museum in Los Angeles and the Trinity Park Conservancy in Dallas. They are also celebrated educators, with Marion Weiss serving as the Graham Chair Professor of Practice at the University of Pennsylvania, and Michael Manfredi as a Senior Design Critic at Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. We're thrilled to host the visit with the UT SOA community. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather, and we're absolutely thrilled to be here. This idea of your naming this lecture series Planetary Imaginary really gets us to think about what truly drifts and what remains enduring. We're so thrilled to actually be giving this lecture at the school, but also at a place that values the idea of maybe transgressing some of the boundaries that might limit what the world of design can do. And we've in fact had an amazing set of tours, just yesterday and today, that have given us a sense of Austin as a terrain of many layers and many places to drift and discover.
I think we're also very privileged to host, I think, what is an incredibly robust internship program. So I think we have a chance not only to speak to faculty members here who we admire, but also see the kinds of students that come out of this program. So I think we're very doubly honored to be here. We also have some guests who are clients, so this is a very different conversation from the Nelson Atkins Museum. And I think that kind of cements the idea that academia and practice for us are very much seamless.
And we'll begin with, in a sense, a peek into the work behind Drifting Symmetries, and outside, if you are so inclined, there are copies out there, but just to really situate the thesis of our thinking, and then really share about 10 projects, of which the final one would be the newest and the most delicate in its prospect right now, which is the Nelson Atkins Museum addition and renovation.
So I think we all know the world is small, getting smaller, and we also recognize that the challenges we all face, whether we're architects or just citizens, are extreme. And I think this also calls for a level of optimism, not pessimism. And that's also driven by the kind of research that Marion and I have been doing for well over 2 decades, which is we're very, very in a way, reluctant to think about utopian visions. They're often singular, they don't adjust, they don't accommodate. We'd much rather think of architecture as a network, an ability to kind of accommodate different climates, different conditions, whether they're social, cultural, or environmental. Kind of an architecture that, in effect, is much more elastic. So that, I think, was a provocation. After talking about this for a number of years, we were challenged by some of our colleagues to go ahead and make a book, which in itself is probably harder than making a building. So we'll only do that every once in a while. But that also brought into sharp focus the idea that there are precedents, case studies that are multidisciplinary that address social and cultural and environmental issues that for us have been touchstones in a way, instrumental in providing a level of inspiration. So we did a kind of catalog of projects that fit in this kind of in-between world of architecture, infrastructure, and landscape, and thought that we would really take a much deeper dive. So we're not going to go through the whole book. It's available out in the lobby, but I think we wanted to use this as a way of thinking about how we can kind of find a sort of intellectual mentorship through looking at other projects like Indian stepwells, which are extraordinary pieces of architecture, but operate both socially and infrastructurally. And they have great lessons about climate to teach us. So we did, I think, a very robust idea of documenting these in our office as, in a way, an homage to, and perhaps an act of love toward what great architecture can do.
And what great architecture can do is it endures in ways that change over time. And so for us, we've had a massive crush on the Spanish Steps. Michael grew up in Rome and had a chance to actually experience the fact that it's a social condenser as it operates to create this sectional urban space and place of movement that is incredibly inefficient and beautiful because of its inefficiency. And as we started to actually build these models in our office and unpack them, it was so interesting to look at both the figure of the steps and the figure that it opens to of the plaza below. And again, as we start to think about the reaching out then and actually sprawling a little further to do something incredible, certainly Gaudi's Park Well is an icon for us. It begins with symmetry, but drifts out to have this infrastructural narrative that becomes rough-hewn in the very way it's made. But as you look at it, it does something that nobody seems to know about, which is at the very, very top, these columns collect water, and as they collect water into this market-style space, it's actually organized into a cistern. So in many ways, it was, in a sense, it was preternaturally aware of kind of environmental systems that we are taking very seriously now. We'll share our project for the US Embassy in India. But in that case, you'll see that this narrative of water and of layers and of systems and shade we have really experienced the value of it here, today especially, are elements that are enduring as well. And we'll also talk about the Olympic Sculpture Park of literally constructing sites that may not be there rather than reacting, actually inventing. And again, even we'll talk about the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, but again, this whole idea of topography and inhabiting topographies and delaying that sense of arrival to actually experiencing something far more amazing. We'll be able to reveal things by our super aggressive, scratchy, thinking out loud drawings to some of the ones that are more precise and more delicate.
So we also thought we'd show a few projects, obviously, that are very, very current. But also in conversations, we thought we'd share some projects that have been around for a while, because I think we often forget that projects have a life beyond opening day. So some of you might know this project. This is the sort of visitor center for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which is a 64-acre tiny botanic garden, but it's in the middle of New York City and an incredible oasis. So this is what the entry used to be. Kind of, you'd have to queue up and go through this narrow slot. And we thought, rather than think of it purely as a building, let's think of it as a sort of a gradient between city and garden. So these little origami studies take that kind of idea and start to spatialize it, or at least construct it in ways that might start to kind of give us cues as to how architecture should operate. So the building, as you see, is overtly architectural as it fronts the kind of Washington Street, very important street in Brooklyn, and then kind of slides or slaloms into the garden and becomes more overtly a piece of landscape. And we'll talk a little bit about architecture's capacity, I think, to kind of reinvent movement, which is, I think, one of the things that architecture can do that the other arts can't do in the same way. So the sense is that you could slide through the building. You don't have to go into it. It's a porous gateway. At times you can leave the garden, and the building in a way marks a passage. So that sense of movement through, never experiencing the building as a singular object, but part, as we said earlier, kind of a network. And this kind of sort of curve that took quite a bit of time to kind of calculate, the kind of calculus of this curve is a function of the drip line of this very rare green cherry tree. So the sense that architecture can acknowledge landscape is, I think, part of the message in this building. You can certainly go into the building. The whole idea, the didactic aspect of the building is that it teaches you about the garden. So the idea is to go into the building and into the garden as quickly as possible. There are moments where this becomes a kind of community room. It's a sort of two-sided room, which we thought would be kind of an interesting way of exploring the geometries of this particular building. And then at night, or even in December, it becomes a kind of a lantern.
And as Michael's described this, there's some very interesting things that are obvious when you look at it there, which is there's a green roof. But there's many agendas here in terms of the garden's commitment to sustainability and demonstrating it. The green roof collects the water runoff. We have a series of rain gardens. We have a distributed geothermal set of wells. And so every element of water is harvested and somehow brought to the irrigation of both of our 10,000 square foot green roof, part of the exhibition, if you will, and to the garden itself. But we love this image here because it's basically saying that you can be 100% landscape and 100% architecture all at once, giving you a sort of an abstraction of what 200% might be. And yet there's times where as much as we like form and we'll chase it down to the end of the world, every now and again we like our architecture to disappear. And it does so here within the garden at that moment where it's fully embedded within this 20-foot hillside. And in that lifting or lofting, you can actually see that whole idea of the topography being inhabited and just peeled open, and what Michael shared as that event space you can see again here on the oblique. Now, as we looked at it, we were hoping to be completely urban and architectural at the urban edge, but become 100% natural at the other edge. However, the site that had originally been planned, which was dead center in the garden, which we suggested should be moved to the city edge, remained a remnant. And so we worked together with the garden to get a grant to basically keep them from the lawsuit that was lurking on the edges for ADA accessibility. This had been what had been proposed to be able to say, let's make this accessible and skip the whole discussion. And our question was, well, maybe this could become a new garden. And over 1,200 linear feet, we could actually create something that would be a journey or a new garden from the subway and actually allow both ends to connect. And by using, a mass customization of these precast walls, we were able to actually build and construct this site to handle the incredibly steep runoff and washout that was happening, and also manage it now with a garden that's really like no other, with crepe myrtle groves within other natural habitats, working with Toby Jones, a horticulturalist, to actually get this journey to be something that felt completely natural. And so you'll see in this very brief film the fact that it changes over the season. And you'll notice that the roof is entirely red. In the fall, we love that it changes colors. We love that it doesn't look like an ADA ramp at all, but it looks like a journey or kind of a wandering landscape. We're thrilled that people are doing dances and actually recording space on that journey. But mostly it's about being part of the city again, part of the garden, and saying that these are, in fact, married together. So this question of what happens when things are married together, what they were probably asked for you, was the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale University. We were asked to do an addition to Marcel Breuer's Becton building, which you can see back there on the side there. And as you look at it, and this is the roof of one floor of the labs, and it's really the engineering area on campus. We said we're not going to touch that masterpiece. We're going to do something altogether different. And we, in fact, said if we could create something, since it's a place of innovative thinking, that would almost draw like a light bulb, a sense that something else is happening here. What if, with no small obligation to other artists who have conceived Magritte of what light can do when we see it, is what would happen if we could see between the cracks of the engineering buildings something that has never been seen before. And so we started to recast that roof of that lab building into a new landscape, and started to think about the one moment we would mess with Marcel Breuer was his barrier wall from the academic quad here by the president's office and up to the roof. And if we could eliminate it and create a new landscape, we could create this new prospect for this very petite 12,000 square foot curved glass lantern, which is where collaboration and convening and entrepreneurs are gathering. And we were thrilled with the glass fabricators in China who were able to create both flatness and curvature so that we didn't need columns all the way throughout the mullions here, because 22-foot span is structurally stable with its curvature. And you can start to see that really it's a place of convening. This is the moment when it just opened before they've really started to work it. But you can start to see that it also has a chance to be changing. And this is the curtains that are actually automatically drawn when the light is strong or when they want privacy with a clear story at the base. And again, breakout spaces, they're acoustically independent but visually connected to what's happening here. But I think the thing that we're most excited and most proud of is that the question was, how could you make the collegiate Gothic world of Yale and that brutalist world of Marcel Breuer look as if they were married? And finally, on the left, you can see that marriage of those two languages. And of course, it is a lantern at night, and it truly has become a draw. It is really one of the most well-used spaces and one of the tiniest spaces on Yale's campus.
So in a similar mode, I think this issue of how do you make a place, how do you draw people into a place, and how do you kind of use architecture and landscape to, in a way, establish the specificities of place. So labs are usually very insular. They're not particularly urban. They're very, very, in a way, otherworldly. And so we were given this very challenging site at the University of Pennsylvania, very dry, not a tree in sight, and yet the university has an extraordinary set of quads. So what to do? We sort of peeled back and decided we'd take a much broader look and understand this particular site as a sort of threshold between the city of Philadelphia and the campus, that these two worlds are starting to increasingly become merged and talk to each other. And we also love the syncopation of the very beautiful Penn plan for Philadelphia, kind of combination of open spaces and buildings. And so we thought, rather than just think of this as a building, let's think of this as making a mini quad. And if we could take the lab building, push it back, and then take some of the programs and wrap it in a kind of like a Mobius, we could create a kind of three-dimensional quad, which is, in a way, the kind of hallmark, well, we see it here too, the hallmark of a kind of traditional campus like Penn. But it's also an opportunity to take these different worlds and think of them sectionally. It's a tight site, so how do you move through a building that avoids the kind of problems of balkanization by floor? So this was actually a photo taken just when the building opened, and the trees now have come into their kind of full maturity. And you can also see the serendipitous discovery that the dean had of finding a David Smith sculpture, Tony Smith, sorry, hidden away in the university archives. So I would encourage every dean that we talk to look at the university archives, because who knows, it could be an extraordinary sculpture. This green lawn also is a giant cistern, and we'll talk about the importance of water and managing water. But it's interesting not only because of the cantilever, but the more challenging aspects are the sort of lateral loads. So there's a kind of structural challenge that comes with the kind of simple idea of, well, we'll make a Mobius, and you know, like many architects, you do a kind of quick scheme, and then you go, oh my God, how are we going to do this? In this case, I think we were privileged to work with an incredible engineer, Severid Associates. But you can start to see how this three-level space tends to play out, and how these different layers cantilever out without the necessity for columns. So they're actually hung from the roof, and the lateral loads are held by this sort of triangular diaphragm action, this kind of truss. And that allowed us to create a very tall space, in effect, a porch to the building itself.
So, you know, you may wonder about what's up with the yellow glass. If you've ever been in a clean room, and probably most of you maybe have yet to do that, the walls are very, very solid, but the doors have a yellow portal, and that's because you need to actually stop the infrared light through there, and that is what controls it. As we were visiting clean rooms with our client, we said, what's up with that? Nobody can see anything in, and could the amber glass actually be comprehensively the facade of this clean room, and then everybody could see in and out? Nobody had done it before, but we were able to do some research and find out that you could do it. And so you can start to see the folks in the, you know, in the very clean environment are in the bunny suits. And that's really interesting. By contrast, the microscopy characterization suites needed to be away from vibration, need to be away from EMI, electromagnetic interference. And so they're down on the lower level where things are most stable. But we're drawing the hillside down so they can get natural light as well. But the most important thing in many ways for the university about making everything visible is that this is the most hidden part of their research. They really want to encourage and welcome the pipeline of future engineers. And so they regularly host in this space, these kind of hackathons to really encourage this use of thinking. But, as Michael mentioned, this question of seeing and being seen is something that these stairs enable people to actually socialize. Dean Eduardo Glant had said, because the elevators have to be so remote to avoid the vibration and the electromagnetic thing, we have to make the most irresistible stair. And so we do so, but carefully put power there so people actually get their laptops on those intermediate landings. These are 20-foot floor to floor, effectively 2 stories for every floor. But it's the whole idea of seeing what's going on and feeling like you're part of a community, including at the very, very top, the Glant Forum, which in many ways has a chance to look out over the university and becomes an emblem of invitation as it hovers up in that origami that Michael described and looks at the rising level there to situate the Tony Smith so effectively. And as you start to look at it, really, in some ways, it's kind of amazing at night because it changes its personality altogether and becomes an emblem of illumination within the engineering community. So again, this is really looking at it as a building in motion. We talk about drift, but what our hope for is that the community of collaborators and scientists and engineers who are in here are more predisposed to drift and discover new things. And so if we go to another part of engineering and science, we think about the invention of a whole, effectively, university setting. Cornell Tech, the Technion in Israel, Cornell finding a place on Roosevelt Island, in effect, to really advance the connections between entrepreneurial invention and the research community. And so you can see there's a very strange thing on this island, a rather amazing island subject to flooding. You all might know about Hurricane Sandy, but with amazing views. And when we were given the site for what is now the Tata Innovation Center, the bridge, it was really having half of it for startups and half of it for the academy. They gave us this really weird site and told us to put an atrium in the middle. And we said, do you have any idea where we are? We're on Roosevelt Island. We are literally in the Ile-de-Cité in New York. We could have river-to-river views, but we could also split the building in pairs so the entrepreneurs and the academics actually have a chance to convene around maybe the Spanish Steps, who knows. But if you start to think about that, the whole idea of the flood resilience meant that we raised up all the critical infrastructure, all the classrooms, brought everything up, and in effect, again, started to look at that topography of collaboration through the worlds of the world's most inefficient circulation, but ideally the most efficient place to catalyze conversations. You can see we're in dialogue with the Bloomberg Center on the right by Tom Main, our building there on the left, but the most important thing we did was literally elevate the corners so that rather than blocking all the views of the river and of the cities in two directions, we elevated it. And elevated it and actually split apart and made this connection with the landscape to say that we are finally open out on the central green that's been invented and that you can actually start to understand a place of invitation.
So many buildings have four corners. We thought it actually would be great to make this much more fractal, so it actually has 8 corners, which gives, I think, in a way, natural light to what would otherwise be a very, very deep floor plate. Marion talked about the areas of convening that are more public, and those are in the center that you see that capitalize on these extraordinary views. But it's also an opportunity, and this is a truly public space. It's actually mandated in Cornell's charter with New York City. So it is, in a way, our homage to the Spanish Steps, a kind of place where you can, in a way, linger or move through. And the idea of moving through a tall building, in this case it's not very tall, it's six floors, I think that kind of choreography is, I think, a lesson that is extremely important to us, a sense of a promenade or choreography. So you can move up to that kind of piano nobile that is, again, protected from rising sea levels, up through another stair. You can enter a studio that, in turn, also is double height. And this particular corner here has become an incredibly popular spot. And you can start to see that students gather, they move furniture around in ways that we never anticipated. So it's fantastic to kind of think of the work that we do, the work that you all do, allows for a level of inhabitation that you perhaps don't anticipate. And that, again, is, I think, a lesson for us as architects. So that's that particular spot where you're hovering almost 30 feet out in the air and could start to get a kind of sense of being this kind of miraculous point over the East River. And then finally, 40,000 square feet of solar panels allow this building and the Tom Main building to be use probably about 60% less energy. But what we've discovered, as we all know, each passing year gets warmer and warmer. This has become an incredibly important and very shaded spots. And we capture views and also capture these kind of breezes. So it's become one of these unprogrammed spaces that has become heavily programmed. And that sense of chance is, I think, another lesson that we are starting to appreciate. We love the sense that there are mega trusses that you see kind of etched into the building, so that quite literally the building's supported on 8 columns. And it literally floats, in a way, as an acknowledgement of our contemporary technology, which pays great respects to the 19th century technology of the very beautiful Queensborough Bridge. So we're very privileged to be working on the US Embassy in New Delhi, India, which is an extremely complex project in a country with an incredibly rich architectural tradition. This happens to be the site of Edward Durell Stone's very famous chancery. And one of the goals was to kind of save the chancery. But Edward Durell Stone was a very important architect in the 50s, was very inspired by the Taj Mahal. And while they don't look like each other, there's a sense of symmetry to this particular chancery. And we came onto the project also very, very excited and inspired by the tradition of Mughal architecture and Mughal gardens, where water is treated as a very precious resource. There's a sort of sense of balance between what's inside, outside. The geometry of the garden corresponds precisely with the geometry of a building. Then there's also the kind of history of using local stone to create these amazing fortifications. And we know Le Corbusier was greatly influenced in his great work at Chandigarh by the Agra Fort. And if you see these giant drums, you can start to appreciate that. So our goal was to, in a way, save and ultimately restore these 2 buildings that are outlined in red, which is the Chancery, and then the smaller but very, very beautiful Ambassador's Residence, and to kind of reconfigure, in a way, a plan for this very large embassy complex to grow over time. So rather than think about the buildings, we thought about using a kind of linear path to connect both new buildings and existing buildings. And it's a way, it's a linear garden, kind of the French would call this in the Beaux-Arts tradition a tapis vert, a green carpet that in a way is the driver. Again, thinking about the importance of Mughal architecture and gardens. And that green carpet in turn allows us to decentralize the idea of capturing water. Again, building on the tradition that we talked about earlier, Indian wells have a sense that they in a way anticipated how important water is. So we're developing a system to capture water and keep it during the dry period. So ultimately, there'll be 2 significant buildings and a collection of smaller buildings on this site. So we'll just go through a kind of animation that, in a way, talks about how this project evolves conceptually. The idea of developing the promenade and connections with 2 entry gates. The idea of then thinking about a series of sunken gardens that would allow us to put program, about 70,000 square feet of program below grade, where it's cooler, lit through a series of courtyards and landscaped ground planes. And then there's a rather robust program to plant trees to provide shade, native trees. And India has a number of beautiful jacaranda trees, Dolonex trees. And then here you can start to see it's a little faded, but the composite. So this becomes the kind of armature against which a series of architectural elements play off. Similarly, in India, the idea of walls moving from a very public condition to a very private condition are not pejorative. They're very important to the tradition of Indian architecture. So we want to respect that with a kind of entry area. And then a shaded garden where you can wait and get your visas, which is a very, very, I think, often underappreciated, important aspect of embassies, and very stressful. So we wanted to make a very beautiful garden. That, in turn, allows us to create, you can start to see at the lower level, a series of sunken courtyards. And then that allows the kind of the complete assembly of these 2 buildings, the building on the right being the Edward Durell Stone building. The building on the left is our homage to that and a new in a way, fairly significant chancery. Whoops. Okay.
So if we think about the Chancery, the main embassy on the right, the Chancery effectively doing the work of what the embassy can be, so that could be a more public building. You can start to see that slalom is really situating that one as a foreground. We set our building back. That's why so much of the square footage we brought below grade so that it could be set back. But we also said that there was a reflecting pool that was losing 25,000 gallons of water a day in evaporative use. We said, what if we could be more strategic with that and really reduce the amount of water loss, but also create a cistern? In fact, under construction right now is the equivalent of an Olympic-sized pool excavation that is there on site, which will be the source for water collection. As we come over to our building here, what we started to look at, though, is something that you all are probably highly conscious of, which is outdoor cooling. And so in addition to the shade, we have a skim of water here upon the arrival of the building that offers its own outdoor evaporative cooling environment in the shade. And again, it brings you into this lobby here, which is really a gallery space. You can see where people gather for meals, et cetera, is right in the back. But this is a convening area that has less security obligations than some of the interior spaces and the offices. But as we were talking about that, it's really ultimately setting up the situation where the Chancery building and our new building could be connected through these lower level courtyards and spaces. And you can start to see the consular flow, though, on the other side. Again, as Michael mentioned, the Delonix trees, the jacarandas, the whole ensemble of the landscape has informed every part of it. But so too is the kind of the robust influence for us, and you can see in our charcoal drawings, of these kind of drums and walls that have really been so powerful and enduring. So you can start to see this sketch here again with the kind of the threshold. And again, also starting to think about on the left where the Durrell Stone building has a jolly screen of sorts that is so beautiful at screening out the sun, but you can't see out of the building. And so our question was, could we actually screen the sun on the exterior and still see out? And come up with a new language that somehow fuses the gift of those thin columns that are in the periphery of the pergola and the kind of identity of that jolly screen as something that might actually do more than one thing. And that led to the creation of, through our sun studies, a slightly wandering jolly screen, if you will, that is able to reduce the sun significantly. And in so doing, actually, on the oblique, start to create that mineral quality of opacity, which we find so beautiful, even though it's got 100% vistas through the views. So this is the one building. This will be completed in construction in February, very much in the thick of construction, setting up the situation to decant everybody out of the embassy space and out of the office building so this construction can begin right in the spring. And I think for us, it really is that sense of the ensemble of time, of history, of material clarity, both with the landscape and the materials here, that will actually be part of an enduring setting, we hope, for diplomacy, which has never been more important than it is right now. So again, if we start to think about what does diplomacy look like with nature, what does it look like with art, what does it look like with urbanism, the Olympic Sculpture Park became, in many ways, an incredible opportunity to have the improbability of a failing site, fully contaminated, 40-foot grade change, a failing seawall, train tracks, a federal trucking route, identified by the Olympic Sculpture Park Committee, if you will, the museum, the Seattle Art Museum, to say, why don't we do an open sculpture park that's free and open to the public? They didn't quite know what to do, so they opened up an invitation to artists, landscape architects, and effectively said, we're not sure what to do, but we have a hunch we want to be here. And in effect, what we did was, and we'll unpack it in a little moment, we basically said, if you could take a 200,000 cubic yard earthwork and actually create a form of land art in and of itself that could wander across the highway and train tracks and somehow even rebuild that seawall, that we could begin to have a Kunsthal that convenes and an incredible sculpture park. But this is the way we think here, and this is kind of a Museum of Modern Art collected this drawing to say it was like this sort of thinking X-ray of everything all at once. And the all at once also included the question about could we in fact get a federal grant so that we can have some salmon habitat and pay for the seawall with other funds. because the rebuilding in many ways was part of a systemic understanding where we had nature, we had walkways, we had power grids, we had a need to actually keep some contamination wells accessible, and then also start to think about how we could collect water and cleanse it along the way. We were exactly at the early concept schematic phase 100% over budget because our walls were so expensive. We wanted beautifully formed in place walls. And so we thought, oh my God, they were so important. Those walls are so important. And we, all of a sudden though, we're looking around with our engineers, said, you know, highway construction's not so bad. And we can use mechanically stabilized earth, which you can see those stacked gabion baskets. And then we were able to actually create these kind of overlapping precast concrete walls from Canada that would overlap because of the seismic movement needed to be accommodated at the same time, but also go just 42 inches above the ground plane, so we didn't need any extra handrails. So in a sense, it's like all these things all at once. You can see the 200,000 cubic yards of earth. Again, we were over budget once again. Thank goodness the museum was doing expansion downtown. They had to dig a big hole, and we got all this dirt for free. So again, you got to think about all these things all at once, but the all at once factor really was about thinking about what it might be to bring everybody together, create a topography where Richard Serra, for instance, his piece Wake could never look better. But even in many ways actually take that question of what does it mean to come with, 10 flatbed trucks to get the steel over here, and Richard Serra being the only person in the world who could demand a 15-foot radius around where he thought the foundation might be, just in case he changed his mind when the cranes were dropping things in place. Love to have that. But the idea, though, that it could be both sublime and it could also be a place where you might want to wander, a place where you could actually start to see the way the site was constructed and unfolded happening once again at the micro scale here for the architecture to unfold. So a 70-car garage could be accommodated as well as a Kunsthal inside. And here you can see Pedro Rey's piece, the mural, and the cupolas there being the debut piece of the art to sort of say this is going to change and will always change. But it's changing in the setting of an ever-changing landscape, which is 100% artificial to feel 100% natural. And so too is the convening that topography offers, and ends up being a place of gathering, and yoga classes and all kinds of things are happening again that nobody knew, but have been scripted in new ways. But again, this was a case of being called the Olympic Sculpture Park because of the Olympic mountains across the way. And that is really emblematically one of the most important things, was that everything needed to have a chance to have views in every different direction to bring you to, in this case, the construction of being over the highway.
Just a footnote, Mary and I do many drawings, encourage folks in our office to do drawings. We also believe design has to operate with a very large toolbox. So there's films, animations, digital models. I think we're in a school of architecture, both Mary and I teach, and we encourage everyone to, in our office, including ourselves, to operate with as many tools simultaneously. Otherwise, you tend to fall in love with the tool that you're most comfortable with, which is always dangerous. But we're now exactly over Elliott, a 4-lane highway. And the idea is that the highway completely disappears. We've since come back. This is a kind of great place where selfies are taken. So that grass there had been completely trampled over, so we've introduced a kind of a stone walkway so that you can still take selfies and do it in a way that becomes part of the magic of this particular site. And you can start to see how that's kind of taking shape there. So this photo by Iwan Bond was taken about 5 years after the park first opened. So you can start to see the trees are kind of taking on a level of maturity, asserting themselves, and at times the grass changes color. So at the end of spring, some grasses start to turn brown. And again, the sense of architecture kind of molting and in a way changing its characteristics is something that we think we try to achieve in this particular project and in others. At times, we love the idea that you could slide under the highway and maybe never care about art, but know that there's something special happening up above. And at times, we love the idea, and this was actually Richard Serra's comment to us, which was the trains become the most extraordinary mobiles. And the sense of this train moving up from Los Angeles up to Vancouver becomes a moment where the train spotting community, which had been relatively silent during the project's development, suddenly became one of the great constituents and great supporters of this project. So it becomes a kind of performance, the train. And there's a very beautiful throw fence by one of our friends, the artist Teresita Fernandez. So that sense of the reciprocity between the architecture, the art, and the infrastructure, we hope kind of gives another dimension to what we see and how we establish a sense of place. At times, the waterfront gets reconfigured, and this is one of the areas we're most proud of, as Marion talked about, the sense that you could get a grant. And as that park matured about 5 years ago, this Jaume Plensa piece was installed, which again changed the character of the intersection along the water in a very interesting way. And that kind of intersection between what's sort of mineral and what's liquid also is a source of a great, I think, pleasure for us, and we're great admirers of Smithson's work. Here this beach was actually highly engineered. We had several hydrologists talking about how to reclaim salmon habitat, which is an opportunity that most architects don't have a chance to think about, and what is the subsurface or the aqueous condition of these terraces for salmon habitat. And you could start to see the kind of engineering drawings that were developed by their biological studies of salmon habitat. So we've now gone back, and it's been a little over 10 years since the park opened, and that salmon habitat now is flourishing. So that's one of those other aspects that we tend not to think about, a kind of sense of how architecture can sort of engage a larger environment. Do a little film that really talks about the sound. We are living in an incredibly visual world and forget the importance of sound in architecture.
Spencer Finch, by the way.
Yep. So there are new art pieces every 6 months. This is the cutest little girl. So the sound of trains become part of the kind of architectural experience. Okay, so we're, I think, nearing the end. We have a few more projects. Hunter's Point is a very public project, a park in New York on the East River that, because of its location, capitalizes on a series of extraordinary views. But it's also, like many urban areas, subject to an incredible level of transformations. It used to be, pre-colonial times, one of the most significant wetlands. Then was transformed during industrialization of New York City, and then went fallow and was sort of largely abandoned, which you see in the image on the upper left. So Mayor Bloomberg's initiative was to reclaim this to spur development of affordable housing. So often in New York, public spaces come after development. Here, actually, it's a brilliant idea to kind of generate value. But it also, we love the very idiosyncratic edge condition, which allowed us to create a series of different events. So the park becomes a series of events rather than a singular experience. And we also began, after talking to a number of hydrologists, playing with the idea that the waterfront could be kind of a sponge. And this was at the time, it wasn't our idea, it was, I think, had been around a long time, but was radical in terms of the New York City Parks Department. And the idea that flooding could be seen as an interesting way of recreating and dealing with what we all are going to deal with soon was also a rather radical proposition. So the green oval actually is a giant cistern. Hurricane Sandy came about the same time that the park opened. We were able to absorb the water and then slowly release it, because with hurricanes and flooding, it's never the water that's coming in, but it's always the water that's rushing back out. So this gave us an opportunity, in a way, to do a full-scale prototype. So New York City Parks Department now is using this as a model. So there are different events. There are playgrounds and this large soccer field here, which is very heavily used as the housing is now developed. And you can start to see the kind of piping underneath that are sort of, it's kind of giant trench drains that then gather the water, and then through a series of locks, dams, they're quite small on the far right, that water is then released. The pavilion, which you see here, also, like Marion described, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden is, in a way, not only a piece of architecture, but it's also a piece of infrastructure. So we can capture water in the valleys of the folds. And then the south-facing parts of the roof allow the sort of park itself to be net neutral in terms of energy consumption. But we also love the kind of shape. It has a sort of a sense that it is nautical, but also provides much needed shade. We were also able to reintroduce some of the plantings that might have been prolific in this particular area. In this case, Ragusa roses or shore pines that love sand and love wet conditions as well. So you can start to see how we're thinking of the architecture as an opportunity to frame a view. I think it's been said by many that often views don't exist until you frame them. So the sense of framing a view in this case, we're exactly on axis with the Empire State Building, very precisely calibrated. And we think of this as a kind of clock that talks about the changing quality of light, in a way enhances or perhaps celebrates that sense of change over time.
So change over time, this was completed, and then funding, of course, paused. And so that the whole of the park that you saw in those diagrams Michael was sharing couldn't be done until later. And so phase 2 came a little bit later, and what was amazing is that this was probably one of the highest points in all of Queens, but this strange ragged edge was very inspiring for us, which was to say, could we actually have a 2-level park? Could part of it be something almost heroically inspired by the industrial exchange and shipping there, or could some of it feel as if we're at the water's edge? And so we did these drawings as a way of thinking out loud about these possibilities, and started to think about that kind of structure that could be made that would allow this kind of walking down to the water's edge, and work with shipbuilders, in this case in Maine, to be able to fabricate something that could be brought on site and ultimately drop down to become indeed this kind of this dual focus, talk about the both and in here within this image. So we have a chance to have that fortified edge there, which you can see not unlike the medieval fortifications that Michael was showing at the very beginning of the lecture, but we actually are able to create a new wetland, and this is filled with water twice a day because of the tidal change, and then becomes emptied. But again, you could start to see some of the things we learned on Seattle with seismic resilience being bedded in the way the concrete is made. But in other cases, recognizing that we have an entirely new artifice, an artificial recreation of a wetlands that was there about 200 years ago. Again, that prow of the ship there inspired, if any of you have been on the West Side Highway and seen the Intrepid, we were so taken with that possibility of the both and. Again, a part here which is an island when the tide is high and is a peninsula when it's low, is that you can start to see now that it changes seasonally there with these incredible gum eagles, but you're here and you have no sense of being part of the city, but you're able to see the prospect of it. And again, that sense that you could make your way out onto the very edge and feel like you're literally over the edge of the river, but maybe even more importantly, have that sense that you're walking on water. And so we love this sense that it's a both and in this park, both active recreation that Michael talked about in phase 1, but a passive place of discovery in this completed park. In this particular film, you can start to see the solar array that's also on the pavilion, along with the water capture that Michael mentioned. It's also a place where the city has really reintroduced ferries, which are very actively used, and hence the kind of ferry waiting area and the cafe here being co-located.
It's not me, by the way.
We definitely like the fact that passive recreation has definitely some interesting characters. And you can see it now when it has no water in it. And this happens again, the twice a day rise and fall, and then ultimately the kind of seasonal exchange that you can start to see. And so we'll go to Longwood Reimagined is the most recently completed work that we've done. And in many ways, we've been working over a decade with Longwood as an incredible steward of DuPont, Pierre DuPont's collection here, where he was trying to save these old growth trees and created a place that was inspired by his tours of Europe. He was very interested in conservatories where he could actually maybe grow some things that wouldn't thrive in the winter, and also at a certain point welcome guests. Now you can see as it historically started to welcome guests, it had some quirks about it. And over time, these a series of production greenhouses and parking were closest to where we are on the lower part of the screen, and then the fancy, conservatory was on the other side. And they had a huge fountain garden. But in some ways, what we started to think when we were invited to think about a new conservatory to really bring forward something else, we started to think about the topography and the pleating of these conservatories as one. You can start to see here, this just opened in November, about what it means to transform an institution. When you have an historic, elevated on the plinth, the kind of cathedral on the hill here of the old conservatory, they had a complete earthwork retaining wall that then actually meant that you would always be seeing the fountains from above. Not a very welcoming and inspiring arrangement there, but what we started to think about is what if we actually would carve a series of vaults and carve into the wall and remove the earth, and we could start to create places to inhabit, and then extend that crystalline ridge further west, where you can see our new conservatory. Again, it really is this ensemble of both a legacy that's 100 years old and bringing it forward into contemporary times. And yet, that carving underneath enabled us to not do a freestanding restaurant, which was the first query, where would we put a new freestanding restaurant, but in fact carve it and hide it in plain sight. And so we were very inspired by bringing that sense of the natural landscape all the way into, and then again these vaults which support 4 feet of soil and an alley of gum trees. And again, you could start to see this idea of a place that feels both welcoming, not so much underground, which it truly is, but something that opens out to the garden and out to the fountains, which are so well known. We worked with the Challenge program, which is a disadvantaged youth who are able to actually get training and actually working with wood. And so the furniture that you see in there is crafted with them in a collaboration. We designed it. But indeed, the kind of question is what happens when you start to think about structure and you start to think about what nature are when they come together. And we started to think about that possibility that the groves of trees that we see on site and the possibility of that structure really start to reach together to create something that in many ways is almost a grove of trees that form this cathedral-like topography. And it's one where the kind of living, breathing idea that we're so inspired by, the botanic life and human life and all of these things coming together mean that this is a work of simultaneity with earth ducts, automated shades, natural ventilation, geothermal wells, so that it's a fully sustainable, and you can start to see those earth ducts and geothermal water collection tanks all sort of in progress. A new garden effectively in progress, and a place where it really turns into this crystalline piece of magic. And it's a piece of magic that in many ways is changing just as much at sunset as it is by day. And it's a place where, in fact, the birds have made their way in through the roof vents, and so that it's not just the botanic life in there, but it's also new forms of life that we like to welcome.
Marion mentioned, typically glass conservatories consume an extraordinary amount of energy. So the challenge here was to use both high levels of technology with sophistication, but many, many simple technologies. Geothermal systems are quite simple. Earth ducts, for example, have been around for about 1,000 years. So the idea of both high tech and low tech was an incredible opportunity. But Marion talked about the trees. There's a grove of sycamore trees, and if you look at how sycamore trees developed, there's a very beautiful moment where the tree trunk splits and it becomes a series of branches. So we worked with Jay Taylor, a brilliant engineer, to rather than do either a space frame or the typical column and beam condition, the columns then split become a series of beams. Then they shift, and each bay has a slightly different meter so that, as Marion said, the roof undulates a little bit. And there isn't, with the exception of the ridge line in the middle, one straight line here. And these were all engineered in Germany, fabricated, and then erected like a giant barn raising at Longwood. We worked with Reed Hildebrand, landscape architects, to develop what is primarily a Mediterranean garden, which is a garden that's likely to require a little water. So it's a chance to think about the beauty of plants that are likely to survive as our climate gets warmer. But everything can start to open up on the vertical surfaces as well as the roof, so that the building literally breathes, like gills on a fish, depending on whether there's a breeze or whether the air is somewhat cool. And you can start to see the interplay between the mechanics of the roof, which we didn't want to hide. We wanted to kind of let the frankness of the kind of interaction between the machine and the building be very, very prominent and very figural. And these very beautiful, elegant, curved column beam hybrids. Whoops, let me go back and just show you how this starts to operate. And there's a little weather station that allows the kind of pistons to open and close. So the water, which is collected, by the way, off the roof, also acts as evaporative cooling. So the roof at times dips significantly. Again, it's our homage to the beauty of the Brandywine Valley, this whole area around Longwood. It's got very soft, undulating topographic conditions. And at times when the sun starts to set, the building on the oblique looks almost solid. At times, you can start to see the interplay between the reflectivity of the collected water, which then gets used for irrigation. Again, over time, over the course of the day, we love how architecture can kind of play and enhance that shift of movement, that sense of the temporal. So the last project we'll share, as Marion said, is the most recent. So you'll have to forgive us if it's still in its nascent stage. But it's an incredibly important project for us because it brings together what it means to kind of use architecture to help an institution invent itself, what it means to kind of think about architecture and landscape as reciprocal rather than antithetical. In a way, this project started, I think maybe a little over 10 years ago. We were invited to kind of look at this as a cultural district. And there were a series of workshops which allowed us and many of the folks who participated to kind of think of this as a district. You can actually see the study model with little red pencils came out of a workshop. This is an area with a number of institutions, including the Kemper Art Gallery, the university, the Nelson Adkins Museum, all very important institutions. And it was maybe a sense of saying, it isn't architecture that matters, but more the perception of how these different institutions could start to interact and be seen as part of a larger ensemble. So in a way, it's a way of re-looking at a set of conditions perhaps in a fresh way without adding architecture. So you can start to see we played with the idea of saying what if around a series of conditions, and it becomes a kind of large sort of figure eight that allows us to kind of think about how close these institutions actually are to each other. And we're very excited because some of these sort of elements are now starting to fall in place. There's a fantastic trolley system that will allow a streetcar system, not trolley, allow for a level of interconnectivity. So this, I think, resulted in a kind of visioning plan for this whole district. And Nelson Adkins, you can see, is on the upper right. So that brought us into, in a way, a number of years passed, and then there was a fantastic competition that we were excited to participate in, and it was narrowed down to about 6 firms, and then we were very fortunate to have won the competition. So we're starting very much to think about this project. Again, the kind of reciprocity between what's existing and what's new is a fantastic opportunity for us to think about how we can kind of reframe, in a way, and reframe a very beautiful garden, but also reframe the existing Nelson Atkins. And many of you know that the existing Atkins building is flanked by a very beautiful addition by Stephen Hall that was done, I think, a little over 10 years ago. But these are little sketches, and we show these because I think in some ways the kind of, the precursor of the idea is often more interesting, and the idea of setting a kind of reanimating the plinth, which is an idea we explored at Longwood, finding a way to kind of do it in a new way here was something that was central to the idea. Then adding a new wing, which you see through those sort of three kind of crescent shapes, that would start to rebalance this very beautiful composition that had been set forward first by the Nelson Atkins Museum in the 30s and then by the Stephen Hall edition, which you see through the series of pavilions.
So if we start to think about what that means, it's that in many ways the Nelson Atkins Museum is this beautiful has declaration of culture right in the heart of Kansas City. The block edition brought this idea of, as has been described, as this kind of translucent addition to really extend its reach and capture one side of the landscape. And for us, it felt very natural to say that if we could balance the west side in many ways, we could bring that next chapter of transparency and engagement with the landscape and full connectivity and recenter that sense of arrival in the middle again. Now, that sense that these things can be seen all together all at once is seen up here on the terrace, which overlooks the sculpture garden, sculpture park, which is so beautiful. But developing a series of leaves that could actually follow the topography down for gallery spaces is what you see here. But what was hidden inside was any connection to the outside. And so by removing some of the stones selectively on axis, we could create a series of what we call art lounges, where art that can actually take natural light can also be co-located with a place of respite and incredible view, giving you a sense of where you are in a museum where from time to time it's hard to know exactly where you are. And yet with the addition, that query of really how can we actually have a place where you could walk on the edge and natural light could be welcome, but in other cases within the galleries themselves, full darkness might be what is really truly required. And so that balance of whether photography might want to be protected the light, some sculpture might be welcoming the light, comes into focus as a promise. And yet as we look at the idea of what it means to arrive, in this case off of Oak Street, is that new edge should not be so much of a barrier, but a place of welcome. And you can start to see this idea of looking in and through and having a clue that there's something there that is kind of a gathering or education commons, because this is also where education and classrooms and black box spaces could also be brought into focus. And again, we love the idea of being able to see the historic museum and the block edition all at the same time from this moment.
Let me add too, is often with institutions, particularly as they grow, different departments are siloed. It's true, certainly, in academia. So this is an opportunity to kind of think about the kind of a very fruitful interaction between a curatorial vision and an educational vision. And so there will be places where these two worlds, which are often pushed into very, very different categories, could start to interact with each other.
And I think as Michael's mentioned, that interaction then could also have something to do with the landscape as well. Currently, the education programs tend to be in some of the lower level spaces that don't get natural light. And so this idea of being able to not only have natural light be part of it, but have people in the park come in and say, wow, what's happening here? And again, making things accessible. There's a lot of topography, and there should be the sense of inevitable movement that we were talking about in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, so that all this multi-level experience is something where you have a sense of how you can navigate to it. And you can start to see then that navigation could allow things like the restaurant and the upper terrace to be co-located. So just as we talked about at Longwood, a carving through the retaining wall, this similarly suggests that we could carve through the retaining wall that faces the garden and open up a new relationship with the garden. And yet the idea of recognizing that performance, education, art, and events have sometimes the most extroverted opportunity as they can here, and Kansas City, of course, is as noted for music as Austin, Texas is that we thought this would be a fantastic way to make that connection between the sculpture garden and the events happening here to be fully woven together. But this is not to ignore what is truly the kind of front entry and arrival. And so what has been inaccessible with stairs that you couldn't quite get to the main museum entry meant that all the entries were taken through the block addition because those were the only ones that were accessible. What we've done is we've elevated the roadway and actually brought the steps closer to the beautiful artwork here, the Maria piece that, again, allows these both to happen. And I might add, by the way, what had been a fully opaque stone wall has, similarly as you saw from the inside, had selective stone removed so that that transparency of welcome can be signaled both inside and outside. And again, this is really suggesting that this is everything all at once. It's about it's a cultural act, it's an urban act, it's a welcome and a transparency to say the community can come here, but it's also part of being a landmark in the city that has a chance to evolve and grow. Now, tell you something that the competition did, which was absolute torture. They said, oh, just do a 2-minute film that says everything about this project. Easier said than done. And so we'll end and conclude with how we were able to try to summarize everything that mattered in 160 seconds.
The music is Kansas City. It's a great music tradition. Okay. Thank you.
So
we usually don't end this way, but you can't. How can you not? Music's fantastic.
It'd be great to be able to share it, but we're obviously so delighted that we're here as part of your program, and we're happy to engage any questions you might have as long as they're not too hard.